The night before she was sent away, Cora Avery sat at the top of the stairs in her stockinged feet and listened to her family celebrate her departure. Her father's voice carried the easiest it had in years, untightened by the usual clench of embarrassment she seemed to produce in him simply by existing. Her mother laughed at something her aunt said, a bright bell-like sound Cora had not heard directed at her since she was small enough to be managed. Her brothers talked over one another with plans for her room. A billiards table, one of them said, and the other agreed immediately, enthusiastically, as though they had been waiting years to say it aloud. Which perhaps they had. Easton will take her off our hands and we will never have to explain her again, her father said, and Cora heard the clink of a glass raised in a toast. She sat very still on the third step from the top. The wood was cold through her stockings. Below her, the parlor lamplight made a warm square on the hallway floor, and she watched it as though it belonged to another house entirely, to a family she had merely been passing through on the way to somewhere else. They were not wrong that she was difficult. She understood that much about herself with a clarity that had long since passed through hurt and arrived somewhere quieter, more settled. She had opinions that she did not keep to herself. She had refused 2 other proposals, one from a man who spoke to servants as though they were furniture, and one from a boy of 19 who cried when she beat him at cards and called it unfeminine. She had once, at a public market, stepped between a merchant named Garrett and an elderly field hand named Joseph Bright, who was too deaf to understand he was being accused of stealing a sack of flour he had already paid for, and she had said things to that merchant that ladies were not supposed to know how to say, and she had said them loudly, and a crowd had gathered, and the merchant had backed down, and her father had not spoken to her for 11 days afterward. That had been 3 years ago. She still did not regret it. Now she was being sent to a man named Caleb Easton, who owned several thousand acres in the mountain country to the northwest, and who had reportedly not come into town in over a year. The marriage broker had called him private. Her father had called him peculiar. Her aunt had called him rough. None of them had been able to tell her much else, except that he had agreed to take her, which in their collective opinion was the only thing about him that truly mattered. She went to bed without saying goodnight to any of them. She folded her few chosen things into her trunk, the books, the good wool coat, her mother's old gardening gloves that no one had asked for and that she had simply kept. She lay in the dark and made herself think practically, because practicality was the only tool she had ever reliably been able to count on, and she made herself a list of things she would not do. She would not cry. She would not beg. She would not arrive at a stranger's ranch and make herself smaller than she was, because she had tried that once, when she was 15, and it had not taken. She would go. She would see what there was to see, and she would decide from there. The wagon ride took 2 days. The driver was a taciturn man named Abel, who clearly had opinions about transporting brides to mountain ranches and kept them entirely to himself, which Cora respected. The country changed around them slowly, and then all at once, the flatland giving way to foothills, the foothills rising to pine-covered slopes, the road narrowing until it was less a road than a suggestion of one, winding up through stands of aspen that flickered silver in the morning light. By the second afternoon, the air had changed entirely. It was colder and cleaner and smelled of something she could not name, something green and mineral and very old. The ranch appeared around a bend without warning. She had expected something grim, something that matched the word peculiar. A sagging structure, overgrown, the visible evidence of a man who had withdrawn from the world because the world had worn him down to something unpleasant. What she found instead was a long, low house of dark timber that sat against the mountain like it had always been there and was simply waiting to be noticed. The outbuildings were in good repair. The fence lines were clean. There were horses in the south pasture, 4 of them, moving slowly through the late-day grass, and a large kitchen garden to the east of the house, laid out with a precision that suggested someone had thought carefully about the light. Abel set her trunk on the porch and left with a nod and no particular ceremony, and Cora stood in the yard with her hands at her sides and looked at the front door, which was plain and heavy and closed. She knocked. He answered quickly, as though he had heard the wagon and had simply been waiting for her to come to him rather than coming out himself. He was taller than she had expected, broad across the shoulders, with dark hair gone slightly long and a face that was weathered but not coarsened. The kind of face that had spent years in outdoor light and taken on a particular quality of stillness from it. His eyes were gray. They settled on her face and stayed there, not roving, not assessing in the way men sometimes assessed her as though she were livestock, just looking, with an attention that was different from what she knew how to categorize. He said her name. Not Miss Avery, not bride, just her name, Cora. And the plainness of it disarmed her more than any formality would have. "Come in," he said. "You must be cold." She was, but she had not been planning to admit it. She followed him inside. The interior of the house was spare but not bare. There were books, real ones, used ones, stacked on shelves built directly into the log walls. There was a stone fireplace large enough to stand in, with a fire already laid and burning low. There was a kitchen with a long table and a window that looked west toward the mountain, and through it the last light was coming down the slope in long amber sheets. She stood in the middle of the main room and looked around her and tried to recalibrate everything she had prepared herself for. "Sit down," he said, and moved to the kitchen. She heard the sound of a kettle. She did not sit down immediately. She walked to the bookshelf instead and read the spines, because she could not help it. It was simply what she did when there were books. When she finally came to the table, he had put tea in front of the chair nearest the window and had sat himself at the opposite end, which was far enough away to be respectful without being theatrical about it. He said, "I want to tell you something before anything else, and I want you to hear it plainly." She wrapped her hands around the cup and looked at him. "All right. I did not purchase you," he said. "I want to be clear about that. Your father sent a broker and I sent the broker back. I will not pay a price for a person. I don't care what the custom is. What I did was write your father a letter saying that I intended to ask you to come here, and that if you agreed to stay, I would consider us married, and that he could do with that whatever he liked." Cora said nothing for a moment. This was not what she had expected, and she had learned to be careful when reality departed sharply from expectation, because the departure itself was information. "He agreed to that?" "He agreed to be rid of you," Easton said, without any particular cruelty, just plainly. The method was secondary. She absorbed this. "And if I don't want to stay?" He set his cup down. "Then you don't stay. I'll give you a horse, a good one, not a cast-off, and enough money to get somewhere you want to go and establish yourself when you get there. You have my word on that. How long do I have to decide?" "I thought a month was fair. Long enough to know if this is a place you can live, short enough that you're not trapped while you're deciding." She looked at him for a long time. He looked back at her with that same quality of stillness, not fidgeting, not filling the silence the way people often did when silence made them guilty. "Why me?" she asked, specifically. Something moved in his expression then, not quite a smile, more a careful arrangement of honesty. "That's a longer answer," he said. "If you want it, I'll tell it. But you've traveled 2 days, and it'll keep until morning." She thought about pushing. She decided not to. "All right," she said. She slept in a room with a window that faced the mountain and a quilt that smelled of cedar, and in the morning the light came in sideways and turned the rough log wall to something that looked, briefly, like gold. He told her over breakfast, without preamble and without particular drama, as though he had rehearsed being matter-of-fact about it. He had been in town 3 years ago on business, buying tack mostly, and waiting on a part for the hayrake, and he had been passing through the market quarter when he heard a commotion. He had stopped at the edge of a crowd and seen a girl in a blue dress standing between a merchant and an old field hand, and she had been talking to the merchant in a tone that had made Easton feel, standing 20 feet away, like he needed to take a step back himself. She had not been loud exactly, or rather, she had been loud in the way that mattered, which was loud enough to be heard but controlled enough to be taken seriously. She had the bill of sale. She had made the merchant account for his accusation item by item until it collapsed under its own dishonesty. And then she had turned to the old man and said something quiet, and the old man had straightened a little, and she had picked up his bag of flour and handed it to him herself and walked away through the crowd without looking back to see if anyone was watching. Easton had stood there for a while after the crowd dispersed and thought about what kind of person did a thing like that, and the word that had come to him, the one that would not leave him alone, was uncorrupted. Not innocent. She was clearly not naive. You didn't talk to a bully that way out of innocence. But uncorrupted. She had not weighed the cost. She had simply done the thing that needed doing and kept walking. He had inquired about her. He had inquired about her several times over the following 3 years, through people who knew people, keeping a respectful distance from it because he was not a man who felt entitled to another person's trajectory. But when he heard the broker come looking, when he heard the name Avery attached to a difficult daughter whose family was eager to make an arrangement, he had made a decision. "You should know," he said, "that I have no certainty this will work. I'm not an easy man to live with in some ways. I keep long hours, and I have strong opinions, and I don't like being in town any more than I have to. But I have a working ranch and a clean house, and I mean what I say, every time. That's what I can offer." Cora ate her eggs and looked out the window at the kitchen garden in the early light and felt something in her chest that she did not immediately have a name for. It was not quite warmth and not quite relief. It was closer to recognition. "Show me how the ranch works," she said. So he did. The days that followed had a rhythm she had not known she was hungry for. She woke early. She had always woken early. It was one of the things her mother called restless and she called natural. And the dawn over the mountain was a different color every morning, rose one day and pale silver the next, and once, during a storm that came in fast from the north, a green-gray that made the whole valley look like the bottom of a lake. She learned the horses first because she had always liked horses better than most people, and Easton seemed to understand this without being told. There was a buckskin mare named Calla who took to her immediately, and a big roan named George who took to no one, and whose acceptance she decided to treat as a long-term project. She learned the cattle work more slowly but with genuine interest because it turned out there was a logic to it, a language of movement and pressure and stillness, and she liked languages. Easton taught without condescension, which she had not quite allowed herself to anticipate, and which turned out to matter more than she expected. He showed her things once, waited to see if she had questions, and then let her do them herself, and when she got something wrong, he told her simply and specifically, not like a correction, but like information, the way you would tell someone there was a stone in the road. There was a hand named Paris who worked the upper pasture and who regarded her initial arrival with the settled skepticism of a man who had watched several things not work out and was conserving his estimation accordingly. He thawed on the fourth day when she spent 3 hours helping him rerun a fence line in cold rain without complaining, and by the end of the second week he was handing her tools before she asked for them, which she took to be the highest form of approval available from that particular man. She found things she was good at that she had not known. She had a head for numbers, and Easton's record-keeping had been adequate but haphazard, and she spent 3 evenings at the kitchen table going through his ledgers and reorganizing them in a way that made visible, for the first time, exactly where the operation was profitable and where it was quietly bleeding. He sat across from her while she did it and worked on the harness repair he had been putting off for weeks, and neither of them talked much, and the fire burned, and the lamp made a warm circle on the table between them, and Cora thought, "This is a thing I did not know I was looking for." Not a man exactly. A room where someone found it acceptable for her to be competent. She did not let herself call it anything yet. She was still counting the month. He was not demonstrative. She had gathered this quickly and filed it without judgment because she was not particularly demonstrative herself, and performed warmth had always exhausted her. But there was a quality of attention he gave her that she had not encountered before, a real, steady, specific attention. He remembered things she said days later and referenced them in ways that showed he had been thinking about them. He asked her questions that were real questions, the kind that expected real answers. When she had an opinion about something, the drainage problem in the east pasture, the best way to store the root vegetables through winter, whether Paris's idea about the additional outbuilding had more merit than Easton was giving it credit for, he did not immediately agree, but he listened with his whole face, and sometimes he changed his mind, and he said so when he did, directly without fuss. Once, about 2.5 weeks in, she was at the far end of the kitchen garden at dusk, staking the last of the late squash before the next frost came, and she looked up and found him watching her from the fence line with an expression she had not seen on him before. It was only there for a moment before he seemed to realize she had caught him, and then it arranged itself back into his usual quietness, and he said something about dinner being close to ready and walked back toward the house. She stood among the squash with the steak still in her hand, and her heart doing something she did not have precise instructions for. She let another 4 days pass before she stopped counting the month. She was not certain when she stopped exactly. She thought it might have been the morning he came in from a pre-dawn check of the cattle and stamped the cold off his boots in the doorway, and she had, without planning it, already put coffee on the table where he sat. He had looked at the cup, and then at her, and she had looked back at him, and neither of them said anything, but something was understood between them that had not been understood before, the way weather is understood before it arrives, a shift in pressure that your body knows before your mind names it. Her father arrived on a Thursday in the 5th week, which was 3 weeks after Cora had privately decided she was not leaving. She saw him from the upper pasture, the familiar shape of his black horse coming up the road, and something in her stomach went cold and then went still. She came down from the pasture at a walk, not a run, because she did not run from things as a matter of practice. Easton was in the yard already, standing square and unhurried in that way he had. Her father had brought her brother Thomas and a man named Fletcher, who worked for the family in legal matters. He dismounted and looked at the ranch with the expression he used when he wanted you to know he was finding something slightly beneath him. He looked at Cora, and his expression shifted to the one he had always used when he was deciding she was the problem in a situation she had not created. "You'll come home now," he said. Not a question. "I won't," Cora said. He began to speak about obligation, about contract, about what was owed and what was proper, and Cora listened to him for a moment and then said, quietly and clearly, "There was no contract. Mr. Easton specifically declined to make one, and I am not obligated to return to a house that counted down the days to my departure and drank to my going." She watched his face go through several things quickly. "I heard you." From the stairs. All of it. The silence that followed was its own kind of weather. Her father's voice when it returned was lower and more dangerous, the voice she knew from when embarrassment had curdled into something uglier. He said things about Easton. Implications, not accusations, the coward's version of slander. He said things about the kind of man who took a woman in without proper arrangement. He looked at Easton while he said them, and Easton stood and listened to each thing without moving, without changing his expression, and did not say a word, which Cora understood was a form of strength that her father was constitutionally unable to recognize as such. Her father left. She thought it was over. 2 days later, a deputy came up the mountain road with a warrant. It was a thin, fabricated thing. Her father had contacts in the county seat and enough money to make something look like something, and the charge was a land dispute that anyone who looked at the actual records for more than 10 minutes would see was false. But the deputy had his instructions, and Easton stood in the yard and said simply, "I'll come quietly. I've done nothing wrong, and the records will show it." He looked at Cora before they took him, just looked at her, and she understood that look completely. It was not asking her to do anything. It was just him, seeing her the way he always saw her, straight and specific, before a thing changed the landscape between them. She stood in the yard after the dust settled and thought with great clarity and without panic. She saddled Calla herself. She took Easton's ledgers, which were now organized in a way that made the history of the property evident at a glance. She took her own accounting of the land records, which she had noted discrepancies in when she was reorganizing his papers, and which she had quietly cross-referenced without saying anything because she was the kind of person who could not leave a discrepancy alone. She rode down the mountain alone in the late afternoon, with the cold coming down off the peaks and the aspens showing their last color, and she thought about the old man in the market square, about picking up a bag of flour and handing it back to someone and simply keeping walking. The county seat was smaller than she expected, and the sheriff's office was easy enough to find. She tied Calla at the post and walked inside and asked, in a voice that did not fluctuate, to speak with whoever had approved the warrant. The deputy behind the desk looked at her with the reflexive dismissiveness that men in official positions sometimes had for women who came in without a man beside them, and she looked back at him with the particular steadiness she had been practicing her whole life. And eventually he went to get the sheriff. She laid the records on the sheriff's desk in sequence. She walked him through the land survey, the county records, the original grant documentation, the chain of title, and finally her own cross-referenced notes that showed, in plain figures, exactly where the disputed claim had been manufactured and what the actual property boundaries were and had always been. The sheriff was a methodical man. She could see him running the figures himself as she spoke, going back to check her work, which she respected. She answered his questions without impatience and with complete accuracy because she had made certain before she wrote down that she knew the material well enough to be questioned on every line of it. Easton was released before sundown. He came out of the building and stopped on the step when he saw her, and she was standing by Calla with her hands in her pockets and the last light in her face, and the expression that crossed his was the one she had caught at the fence line, unguarded and full, and entirely too large for either of them to pretend they hadn't seen. He came down the steps and stood in front of her, close enough that she could see the exhaustion in his face beneath the relief. He said, "You didn't have to." "I had the records," she said. "It was straightforward." He was quiet for a moment. The street was mostly empty around them, a few horses at their posts, a woman crossing far down with a basket. "It wasn't straightforward," he said. "You rode down that mountain alone." "I have ridden alone before." "Cora." She looked at him. He looked at her with that full, undefended attention that she had come to know as specifically his, the way she knew the weight of his silence and the particular angle of his shoulders when he was working something through. "I have wanted to tell you something for several weeks," he said carefully, "and I have been trying to find the right time, which I have come to understand is not a thing I am ever going to locate on my own." She waited. "I did not bring you here to be a worker," he said. "I hoped from the beginning, I had no right to hope it, but I did, that you might stay because you wanted to, because this was a place that fit you, and I think—" He stopped, seemed to make some decision about honesty. "I think you fit it because of who you are. The part of you that everyone called difficult. That's the part this place was built for." The street was very quiet. Calla shifted her weight behind her. "I know," Cora said. She had known for some time, actually. She had been watching it arrive in her from a distance, the way you watched weather come across open country, knowing it was coming before it reached you. "I know what I want." "Do you?" he said, and it was not exactly a question. "I want to go home," she said. "To the ranch. To the garden and the ledgers and George, who I am still working on. To Paris, who I suspect might be growing to tolerate me." She met his eyes. "With you."